Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling journey into the world of shadows, secrets, and quiet suspicions. Tonight, we step into the haunting silence of Bramblegate Tunnel, a place where echoes carry more than just footsteps. They carry fear. In this mystery, Miss Marple finds herself drawn into a web of whispers beneath the old railway arch, where every sound feels like a warning and every clue leads deeper into darkness. So settle in, dim the lights, and allow your mind to follow the sinister footsteps echoing through the heart of Bramblegate. Your next clue awaits. Chapter 1. The Uneasy Evening at Bramblegate. Village of Bramblegate had always carried an old-world charm, cobbled lanes softened by moss, lantern posts that creaked in the wind, and hedgerows thick with thorns that seemed to whisper with every passing breeze. Yet on this particular evening, something felt different. The air held a strange heaviness, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple noticed it the very moment she stepped off the little bus that dropped her near the Willow and Wren tea house. She had come to Bramblegate for a quiet 2-day rest, hoping to enjoy a book by the fire and perhaps a slice of the famous blackberry tort the village was known for. But as always, trouble had a curious habit of crossing paths with her. A warden hurried past her, lantern in hand, his face unusually pale. Miss Marple, leaning on her walking stick, tilted her head. "My dear, you seem in an awful hurry. Is something the matter?" The man didn't stop fully but slowed enough to answer. "It's nothing, madam. Just odd noises again, coming from the tunnel." "The tunnel?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Bramblegate Tunnel?" He nodded once nervously. "A place best avoided at dusk." And with that, he disappeared down the lane, boots echoing like hurried punctuation marks. Miss Marple stood very still for a moment. Odd noises. A tunnel best avoided. Pale-faced villagers walking briskly in opposite directions. Oh yes, there was certainly something in the air that had little to do with mist or wind. She continued her walk toward the tea house, though now her mind was sharpened, attentive, picking up every detail the village unwittingly offered her. An elderly couple whispering at the crossroads. A shopkeeper pulling down shutters, though it was not yet closing time. And most telling of all, the absence of children. Not a single one played near the fountain, where she'd normally expect to see skipping ropes or chalk drawings. Inside the Willow and Wren, the warm scent of vanilla tea greeted her, though the atmosphere was tense even here. "Good evening," Miss Marple said gently to the woman behind the counter. The woman forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Evening. Quite a chill outside tonight." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, and quite a hush, almost as though the village were expecting something. The woman's smile faltered completely. "You've heard, then?" "Heard what, my dear?" Miss Marple's voice was curious but careful, her eyes kind but observant. The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "People say there are footsteps in the Bramblegate Tunnel after dark. Heavy ones, dragging ones, even when the tunnel is empty." Miss Marple tapped her gloved fingers lightly against her walking stick. "And this began recently?" "About 3 nights ago, just after old Mr. Halberd went missing." Ah, there it was, the missing puzzle piece. You see, the woman continued. "He was last spotted near the tunnel. Some say he entered it. Some say he was pushed." She shivered. "And some say he never left." Miss Marple ordered a small pot of lavender tea and chose the corner table near the window. From here she could watch the lanes and listen to the hushed conversations inside the shop. She had learned long ago that people reveal far more when they think no one is listening. A pair of young men entered, speaking in hurried whispers. "Told you I heard it. Footsteps plain as day. But when I shone my torch, nothing was there." "You're imagining things." "No, I'm not. Something or someone is inside that tunnel." The second man gulped. "Then why don't the police close it off?" "Because no one's sure what's inside yet." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Yes, there was something decidedly unnatural about fear that spread so quickly. Fear, in her experience, was often fueled by uncertainty or hidden guilt as dusk deepened. Miss Marple finished her tea and stepped outside. A thin fog had rolled into the village, softening the glow of lanterns and giving the streets an almost dreamlike quality. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her lodging was only a short walk away, a charming stone guest house run by Mrs. Winford, who had greeted her earlier with warmth and fresh linen. But Miss Marple's feet did not turn toward it. Instead, they carried her slowly, deliberately, toward the far end of the village where the old railway tunnel waited. The path narrowed as she neared it, hedgerows rising like jagged walls. The air grew colder. She could hear her own footsteps on the gravel, crisp, light, steady, and beneath them something else. Thud, thud, thud. It was faint but unmistakable. Another set of footsteps, heavy, muffled, uneven. Miss Marple paused, leaning slightly on her stick. She listened. The wind rustled the bramble leaves. A distant owl hooted. But the footsteps, those peculiar, dragging ones, continued somewhere inside the dark stone archway ahead. The mouth of Bramblegate Tunnel loomed like a silent beast, its stone edges slick with moss, its interior swallowed by inky darkness. A single lantern flickered weakly near the entrance, casting a trembling light on the old railway tracks that disappeared into shadow. Miss Marple's heartbeat remained calm, though alert. She had faced danger before, in various shapes, sizes, and temperaments, and she had learned to trust her instincts. And tonight, those instincts whispered that Bramblegate Tunnel held a secret, a dangerous one. She stepped closer, carefully listening again. Thud, thud, thud. But now something new joined the footsteps, a low, slow dragging sound, as though someone were pulling something heavy, or as though someone themselves was struggling to walk. Miss Marple squinted into the darkness. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice steady. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then a sharp metallic clang echoed from deep inside the tunnel. Miss Marple's breath caught for the briefest moment. Something, or someone, had just moved. She took one more step toward the entrance, then stopped completely. There, on the ground, half hidden in dirt, was a torn scrap of dark cloth, and on it, faint but unmistakable, a smear of dried blood. Miss Marple bent slowly. picked it up with her gloved hand, and studied it under the lantern glow. "So," she murmured, "this is where the story begins." And behind her, somewhere in the tunnel's throat, the footsteps started again. Chapter 2. Mrs. Winford's Guest House and the Man Who Vanished. Miss Marple did not linger at the tunnel. Experience had taught her two very important lessons. First, that danger often preferred the cover of darkness. And second, that rashness seldom did any good when one's greatest weapon was observation rather than strength. She folded the blood-stained scrap of cloth carefully, placed it in her handbag, and cast one last glance into the yawning mouth of Bramblegate Tunnel. The footsteps had ceased again, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Only the faint drip of unseen water and the shiver of wind remained. "Very well," she murmured quietly. "We shall talk again in the morning, I think." Turning away, she retraced her steps along the narrow path, her walking stick making a gentle tap against the ground. The fog had thickened, soft around the hedgerows, turning the village lights into vague halos in the distance. It was a strangely fitting setting, she thought, for a place that held secrets. The guest house, when she reached it, stood like a squat, comforting guardian against the chill of the night, a 2-story stone building with ivy crawling along the walls and small lace-curtained windows glowing gold from within. A modest wooden sign swung above the door, "Winford House Bed and Breakfast, Miss." Marple brushed a bit of damp from her coat and stepped inside. Warmth greeted her at once, the crackle of a fire from a sitting room to the left, the faint scent of roasted potatoes and rosemary, and the homely disorder of a hallway cluttered with umbrellas, walking boots, and a stand of neatly labeled keys. Mrs. Winford herself appeared from a side doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a sturdy woman of about 50, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense bun that had clearly been fighting a losing battle with a few stray curls. "Oh, there you are, Miss Marple," she exclaimed. "I was beginning to worry. It's not a night for being out too long. The mist rolls in wickedly thick round here." "Yes, it does seem rather more enthusiastic than one might prefer," Miss Marple replied mildly, removing her gloves. "I hope I've not kept you waiting." "Not at all, dear. I've kept some supper warm, if you've the appetite for it. You look as if you've had quite a walk." Miss Marple's blue eyes glinted ever so slightly. "Yes, I had a little look at your famous tunnel." Mrs. Winford's face changed at once. Her hands, which had been busy folding the corner of her apron, stilled. "Oh," she said quietly, "the tunnel." Miss Marple followed her into the cozy dining room, where a single table had been laid for one with a steaming plate of roast vegetables and a small tureen of gravy. A brass clock ticked softly on the mantelpiece. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the fog and whatever might be moving through it. "You know," Miss Marple began gently, taking her seat, "villages are like families. They develop habits, little worries, and the odd secret or two. And today I couldn't help but notice that Bramblegate is uneasy." Mrs. Winford sat opposite her, not something she might ordinarily do with a guest. Miss Marple suspected, but fear had a way of bending routine. She folded her hands tightly. "You're very perceptive, Miss Marple. she said at last. "We've not quite been ourselves of late." "Since Mr. Halbert disappeared," Miss Marple suggested, spooning a little gravy onto her plate. A faint twitch crossed Mrs. Winford's expression. Relief, perhaps, at not having to be the first to say his name. "Yes," she admitted. "Since then." "Tell me about him," Miss Marple urged. "If you don't mind, that is. One hears so many things, and rumors are such untidy storytellers." Mrs. Winford drew in a breath. "Well, Arthur Halbert, Mr. Halbert, lived alone up near the old signalman's cottage. He was particular. A bit gruff, if I'm honest, but never cruel. He'd worked with the railway years ago, back when the line through Bramblegate was still active. When they closed it, he stayed on. Sighed he couldn't imagine living anywhere else." Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. A railway man living by a disused line. That, she knew, was not as uncommon as it sounded. People formed attachments to their work as well as to their homes, and he had reason to visit the tunnel? She asked. Oh, yes. Knew every inch of it, they say. Even after the line stopped, he'd walk that way as if it were still part of his daily duties. Creature of habit, he was. And when was he last seen? Mrs. Winford swallowed. 3 nights ago. In the late evening. Tom Blakely. You might have heard him at the tea-house, loud voice. Brown cap. He saw Mr. Halbert walking down toward the tunnel path. Said he called out good night to him, and Mr. Halbert lifted his hand without turning round. That was the last anyone saw of him. And what of the noises? Miss Marple asked. The footsteps? The dragging sounds? Mrs. Winford fidgeted with the edge of her apron again. First night after he disappeared, some of the boys heard them. Youngsters, mind. They shouldn't have been out that late, but you know how they are. They came running back saying the tunnel was haunted. We all put it down to fright and fancy, but it didn't stop. No, Mrs. Winford's voice grew hushed. Second night, old Mr. Kemp, he lives near the ridge, half deaf but still nosy as a crow, swore he heard someone walking in there. Heavy steps, rhythmical, like a man pacing. But when Constable Reed went to look, there was no one. No torchlight, no movement, just echoes. Miss Marple thought of the footsteps she herself had heard and the metallic clang that seemed almost deliberate. And tonight? She asked quietly. Tonight it's worse, Mrs. Winford said. Some say they hear something being dragged. Others hear scraping. My Rosie, that's my daughter, insists she heard a voice, but when I pressed her, she couldn't say what it was saying. Just that it sounded. She paused. Lost, Miss Marple was silent for a moment, listening instead to the ticking of the brass clock and the crackle of the fire in the next room. I went to the tunnel this evening, she said at last, doing her best to keep her tone gentle. I heard the footsteps too. Mrs. Winford's eyes widened. You did? Yes, and I also found this. She opened her handbag, withdrew the folded scrap of dark cloth, and laid it carefully on the table between them in the lamplight. The stain on it, rusty brown and mottled, was unmistakably blood. Mrs. Winford gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Is that? I don't know yet, Miss Marple said. but it would be wise to find out if Mr. Halberd owned a coat or jacket made of similar material. Dark wool, worn at the edges. You see the fray here? This is not a new tear. It seems to have caught on something. The brambles, Mrs. Winford whispered. There's thick growth all along the tunnel entrance. Quite so, said Miss Marple. And blood, in my experience, seldom appears without reason. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the desperate, uneven rhythm of Mrs. Winford's breathing. You don't think it's just a missing person, do you? She asked in a small voice. No, Miss Marple replied quietly. I do not. Mrs. Winford swallowed. The constable. He says it might be an accident. That Mr. Halberd may have slipped or gone wandering. But you don't believe that? Accidents do happen, Miss Marple said, folding the cloth again with careful fingers. But so does deliberate harm. One must not be too quick to assume the kindest explanation. She paused, then added, Tell me, Mrs. Winford, did Mr. Halberd have enemies? Enemies? Oh, I don't know about that. He was prickly, as I said. Fell out with people now and then. There was that quarrel with Mr. Kemp about land, and he didn't get on with the younger folk who trespassed near the tracks. And there was some unpleasantness with the vicar over a donation dispute, if village talk is to be believed. But nothing. She trailed off helplessly. Nothing that you thought would end in something like this, Miss Marple finished gently. No, of course not. Evil seldom announces itself in advance. It prefers smaller signs, little grudges, quiet resentments. She rose from her chair, her joints protesting faintly. Though her mind was as sharp as ever. You have been most helpful. Mrs. Winford, if it isn't too much trouble, may I also have a word with your daughter tomorrow? And perhaps with this Mr. Blakely and the constable as well. I find it best to hear every version of a story. It is astonishing how truth manages to peek through the cracks of contradiction. Yes, of course, Mrs. Winford said quickly. Anything that might help. I'll tell Rosie in the morning. And as for Tom and Constable Reed, you'll probably find them both at the tea-house after breakfast. They spend more time there than they do doing any proper work, if you ask me. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then I shall be sure to drop in. She took the scrap of cloth and slipped it back into her bag. Mind already sorting through possibilities. A railway man, a disused tunnel, unexplained noises, and a village whose nervous silence spoke louder. Then its words dot as she made her way to the small bedroom prepared. For her upstairs, a neat space with a patchwork quilt and a small writing desk. She paused at the window dot from here. She could just make out the faint outline of the hill beyond the village, where Bramblegate Tunnel carved its way beneath the earth like some slumbering creature dot in the distance, very faintly, carried by the damp night air. She thought she heard it again, thud. Thud, drag. Miss Marple drew the curtain slowly across the glass. Tomorrow, she whispered to herself, we shall see whether those footsteps belong to the living, or to someone who refuses to be forgotten. Chapter 3. The Tea. House testimonies and the first crack in the story morning came to Bramblegate not with birdsong or cheerful brightness, but with a pale, reluctant glow that barely stretched across the hills. A thin veil of mist still clung stubbornly to the hedgerows, and the air outside felt cool enough to make one's breath cloud faintly. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did, fastening the small brooch at her collar before smoothing the quilt and preparing herself for the day's inquiries. She looked composed, but her mind was already turning, quietly arranging details from the night before like pieces on a chessboard downstairs. Mrs. Winford greeted her with a pot of chamomile tea and a plate of warm scones. "Sleep well, dear?" she asked with a tight smile that didn't hide her worry. "As well as one can when footsteps echoing from a tunnel remain unexplained," Miss Marple replied kindly. She touched the woman's hand in reassurance. "I shall try to learn more today." Mrs. Winford nodded gratefully. "Constable Reed and Tom Blakely will both be at the Willow and Wren by now. They practically live there." "Well then," Miss Marple said, picking up her handbag, "I shall join them." The Willow and WRE and a room full of RORS. The tea house was busier than usual for the hour. A hush fell over the room when Miss Marple stepped inside, and several heads turned in her direction before quickly looking away again, pretending to be occupied with their teacups. Villages always behaved this way when trouble hung in the air, quieter, watchful, brimming with questions no one dared to ask aloud. She approached the counter where Rosie Winford, a soft-spoken girl with wide brown eyes, was arranging pastries. "Good morning." "Rosie," Miss Marple said warmly. Rosie startled slightly. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. Mom told me you'd be coming by." "I understand you may have heard something near the tunnel," Miss Marple said gently. "A voice, perhaps?" Rosie hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening too closely. I didn't hear words," she said finally. "It was more like someone calling. Not loudly, just a lonely sound. A cry?" Miss Marple suggested. "No, not a cry." Rosie frowned, struggling to describe it. "More like someone trying to get attention but too weak to shout. Did it frighten you?" Rosie lowered her gaze. "Yes, it felt wrong. Like whoever it was wasn't supposed to be there." Before Miss Marple could probe further, a heavy-set man at the corner table cleared his throat loudly. Tom Blakely. She recognized him by his brown cap and the slightly overconfident posture of a man who believed he was important in village matters. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he called out. "Heard you're asking about Halberd." Miss Marple approached him with a pleasant smile. "Indeed. I understand you were the last to see Mr. Halberd alive." Tom nodded gravely, puffing his chest. "I passed him on the Ridge Road. I said good evening. He gave me a nod. That was it." "Harmless enough. Did anything seem unusual about him?" Miss Marple asked. "His mood? His pace?" No, Tom said confidently. "He was walking like he always did. Stubborn old fellow. Didn't much care for anyone. A man who kept to himself." Miss Marple pressed. "That's one way to put it." Tom leaned back. "Halberd was gruff. Argued about everything. Land rights, footpaths, the railway closure. Scared off trespassers with that walking stick of his. But murder?" He shook his head. Nah, nobody here's the type. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Villages have surprised me before. Tom shifted uncomfortably at that. Constable Reed entered just then. A tall, earnest-looking young man with sandy hair and a uniform that still seemed too new for him. He held his cap under his arm and looked startled to find Miss Marple staring directly at him. "Good morning, Constable," she greeted politely. "Might I trouble you for a word?" Reed cleared his throat, glancing nervously at Tom. Of course, madam. How may I help?" Miss Marple gestured toward an empty table, and Reed followed. Visibly unsure of what sort of conversation awaited him, she began gently. "I hear you inspected the tunnel the night after the noises began." Reed nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Didn't find anything. No signs of Mr. Halberd, no lanterns, no tracks." "No tracks?" Miss Marple repeated lightly. "Not even on damp ground?" Reed flushed slightly. It rained earlier that day. The ground near the entrance was muddy, but it didn't hold marks well. Miss Marple murmured. "And inside the tunnel?" Reed looked even more uncomfortable. "Inside is dry stone. Nothing prints on it. Sound echoes strangely, too. Makes it impossible to tell where footsteps are coming from." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "Constable Reed," she said softly, "did you truly believe the noises were nothing more than echoes?" Reed hesitated. A pause too long. "I hoped they were," he admitted. "Hope," Miss Marple said kindly, "is not evidence." Reed sighed. "Look, Miss Marple, I've only been constable here for 8 months. I didn't want to frighten the villagers by jumping to conclusions. Would you say the villagers are easily frightened?" She asked. "Not usually, but this? This has them on edge. Because?" She pressed. Reed lowered his voice. "Because Mr. Halberd wasn't the first strange disappearance linked to that tunnel." Miss Marple blinked once, very slowly. "Go on." Reed looked around, then leaned closer. 8 years ago, a boy went missing near the tracks. 12 years old. They never found him." Miss Marple's posture did not change, but her eyes sharpened. "Was he last seen by the tunnel?" "Yes. Some thought he ran away. Others said he fell. But there were no signs. No body. Nothing. And the railway records?" Miss Marple inquired softly. "Any accidents? Loose stonework? Maintenance issues?" Reed shook his head. "Line was closed by then. No trains, no workers. Just the tunnel." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "And yet people continued to use it?" "For shortcuts, yes," Reed said. "But not after the boy vanished. And now, with Halberd gone too." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. A most interesting CONTRADI miss. Marple thanked Reed for his honesty and rose to leave. But before she could step away, Tom Blakely, who had clearly been eavesdropping, called out, "Reed told you about the boy, did he?" Miss Marple turned slowly. "You knew of him too?" "Course I did," Tom said, though his eyes flickered uneasily. "Whole village did. But that was years ago. No sense dragging up old ghosts." "Old ghosts," Miss Marple said gently, "have a remarkable talent for returning when given reason. Tom stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple replied brightly. "Only that I've noticed something most curious. You say Mr. Halbert walked calmly toward the tunnel. But Mrs. Winford says he told her only last week he'd never go near it after dark anymore." Tom blanched, the color draining from his face. Miss Marple continued softly. "Such contradictions often point to either misunderstanding or someone lying." Tom's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words emerged. Constable Reed turned sharply toward him. "Tom, you didn't mention that." Tom swallowed hard. "Look, I may have forgotten. It wasn't important." "Oh," Miss Marple said sweetly, "I do believe it was." The room fell silent. Rosie stepped closer, hands cupped nervously around a tray. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "my mum says if you need anything to come back any time." Miss Marple smiled warmly at the girl, but her mind was already racing. A disappearance. A boy lost years ago. A railwayman who feared the tunnel, yet supposedly walked into it willingly. Footsteps, dragging sounds. And now, a lie. The first unmistakable crack in someone's story. Miss Marple turned toward the door. "I believe," she murmured, "it is high time I visited Mr. Halbert's cottage." Chapter 4. The Signalman's Cottage and the Shadows Beneath the Floorboards. Mr. Halbert's cottage stood at the very edge of Bramblegate, perched on a slight rise overlooking the valley where the old railway line once ran. Miss Marple approached it along a narrow footpath bordered by thick brambles and frost-tipped grass. The cottage itself was small but sturdy, built of weathered stone, with a sagging roof and a crooked chimney that hadn't produced smoke in days. It looked abandoned, but not naturally so. Not like a home left quiet while its owner traveled. More like a place that had been interrupted. Miss Marple pushed open the gate, which gave a loud, complaining squeal. She paused a moment, scanning the area. Nothing stirred. No birds, no rustle, no passing villager. The silence here was deeper than anywhere else in Bramblegate. Unnaturally so. She stepped up to the cottage door and knocked gently. No answer. Miss Marple, who had never been deterred by an unanswered door in all her years of inquiries, turned the knob. It clicked open with surprising ease. She murmured. Either Mr. Halbert was the trusting sort, or someone wanted quick access. She stepped inside. The cottage, with half-told estuary, eased. The interior smelled faintly of dust and cold stone. A small fire grate sat unused. A thin layer of ash still settled inside from its last burning. A teapot sat on the wooden table, lid off and cup beside it, as though someone had been preparing to drink but never returned. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Tea-making was an act seldom done halfway. She moved carefully through the small space, her walking stick tapping lightly against the wooden floorboards. On the far wall hung several old railway lanterns and a faded map of the Bramblegate line, its crisscrossing paths marked with ink scribbles and notations in a neat but aging hand. So Mr. Halbert had not quite abandoned his old duties. Miss Marple scanned the shelves next. Books mostly, history, engineering manuals, railway maintenance logs, and a few dog-eared novels. Nothing out of order, nothing suspicious. until she noticed a notebook lying open on the small side table near the window. She approached it slowly. The last entry read, "Saw him again near the tunnel. Don't trust him. Must speak with Reed." Miss Marple inhaled softly. A confrontation? A warning? A suspicion? But who was him? She turned the page. It was blank. Mr. Halberd had written that worrying line, and then disappeared. A curious Sarah. Miss Marple continued her examination, moving into the bedroom. It was surprisingly tidy, the bed neatly made, boots aligned beside the dresser, and a stack of folded shirts atop a chair. A man of routine, she observed. That much was clear, which made the next discovery all the more notable. A scuff mark on the floor. Then another, and another, forming a faint, irregular trail from the bed to the wardrobe. Miss Marple leaned slightly, studying the marks. Something heavy had been dragged, or someone had staggered. She opened the wardrobe. Clothes hung neatly, nothing amiss, but the floorboard beneath the hanging coats was slightly raised. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. She reached down, pressed lightly, and the board shifted with a soft, telltale creak. "A loose floorboard," she whispered. "Always a promising sign." She slipped her fingers beneath the edge and lifted. The board came away, revealing a small hollow space. Inside lay a rusted railway key, folded piece of parchment, and a leather pouch containing several coins. The coins were unremarkable. The key was interesting, likely to the old signal room or tunnel maintenance door, but the parchment. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map. Not of Bramblegate village, not exactly. It was a subterranean diagram, a layout beneath the tunnel, a narrow service route branching off, ending in a small, unmarked chamber. Miss Marple frowned slightly. A chamber beneath Bramblegate Tunnel? She had not been told of such a thing, and next to the chamber, written in Mr. Halberd's neat hand, blocked off since '58, should stay that way. Below it, added later and more hastily, someone's been down there. Miss Marple sat back slowly, lips pursed. Miss Marple sat back slowly, lips pursed. So Mr. Halberd had been watching the tunnel, not idly wandering near it, as Tom claimed. He'd been investigating something or someone, and he believed someone else had found access to a sealed chamber. She folded the map thoughtfully. This grows more complicated by the minute. A visitor at the door just then. She heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Not hesitant, not casual, purposeful. Miss Marple replaced the map beneath her shawl and stepped back from the wardrobe, positioning herself with deliberate innocence near the fireplace just as the door opened. Constable Reed stepped in. He froze when he saw her. Miss Marple, he exclaimed. I didn't expect anyone here." "Yes," she said mildly. "And yet you came directly, without knocking." "How interesting." Reed's face flushed red. The door was open. I feared someone might have, well, tampered with the place." "A sensible concern," Miss Marple replied, "and one I share." Reed shifted uneasily. "Have you found anything?" Miss Marple regarded him quietly. She did not trust him. Not fully. Not yet. His earlier hesitation, his reluctance to speak plainly, these were signs of a man who felt divided between duty and something else. But she decided to offer him half-truths. Only that Mr. Halberd was a meticulous man, she said lightly, and that he left his tea unfinished. Reed exhaled sharply, relieved. Too relieved. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Constable," she said softly, "why did you truly come?" He swallowed, his throat bobbing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Because I needed to know if you'd seen the loose board." Miss Marple smiled sweetly, a gentle smile that, to the trained eye, meant she had just confirmed something important. "And why?" she asked calmly. "Does that matter to you?" Reed hesitated, struggled, then blurted, "Because that floorboard was already disturbed when I came the first time. And when I returned yesterday, it had been shut tight again, as though someone came back to hide something." Miss Marple tapped her finger against her walking stick. "So you knew something was hidden here," she said quietly. "Yet you told the village and me that you found nothing." Reed looked cornered. I didn't know what Halberd was involved in. I didn't want to stir panic. There's enough fear already." "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is not a justification for withholding information that may concern a man's life." His face crumpled. I know. He stopped, froze, because from outside the window came a faint sound, a rhythmic, heavy sound. Thud, thud, drag. Miss Marple's heart did not race, but her mind sharpened instantly. Reed's face drained of color. That's coming from, yes," Miss Marple whispered. "From the old line." The footsteps grew louder. Closer. Then suddenly, they stopped. Miss Marple turned her head toward the window. Someone was standing just beyond the glass. Watching. A shadow, tall, unmoving. Reed stumbled back, breath shallow. "Miss Marple, what is that?" Miss Marple didn't blink. "Not a ghost," she said softly, "and certainly not an echo." She took a calm step toward the door. "We are being warned, Constable. Or watched. Possibly both." Reed swallowed hard. "Should we stay inside?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh no, my dear. Whoever stands out there has no intention of entering. Not yet. They want us to follow." She opened the door slowly. Fog billowed in. The shadow was gone, but on the ground, pressed into the soft earth, leading away from the cottage, were footprints. Large ones, dragging ones. Leading back toward Bramblegate Tunnel. Miss Marple lifted her chin. "Well then," she murmured, "it seems the tunnel has something more to show us." Chapter 5. Footprints in the Fog and the Tunnel's First Secret. The air outside the cottage was colder than before, as though the fog itself had drawn a long, icy breath. Miss Marple stepped out quietly, her walking stick sinking slightly into the damp earth. Constable Reed followed behind her, far less steady, his posture tense, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The footprints were unmistakable in the soft ground, large, deep impressions, each uneven in weight distribution, suggesting someone limping or dragging one foot. Thud, drag, thud, drag. The very rhythm Miss Marple had heard from the tunnel. She crouched slowly, inspecting the prints. "Notice the spacing, Constable," she murmured. "Far too wide for an elderly man like Mr. Halbert. These footsteps belong to someone taller, stronger." Reed swallowed, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Then who?" "That," Miss Marple said, straightening carefully, "is what we shall find out." The prince led away from the cottage, down the gentle slope toward the valley. The fog shifted around them, parting just enough to reveal a narrow trail snaking toward the old railway track. Crows perched on the wooden fence posts, silent and watchful. Not a single one cawed. Miss Marple found that particularly disturbing. The descent to the terrace, as if they walked carefully, following the trail the further they went. The more Miss Marple noticed small disturbances along the path, crushed bramble leaves, scraped bark on a low-hanging branch. And once a torn bit of gray cloth caught on a thorn. She collected it delicately. Reed looked pale. "Is that from Mr. Halbert's coat?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Different fabric, coarser. Someone else has passed this way recently. But why toward the tunnel? Why always the tunnel?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she paused at the ridge where the trees parted, revealing the old railway line. The tracks were rusted, swallowed by weeds. Small stones that once cushioned the tracks were scattered unevenly. The land dipped slightly where the disused line burrowed into the hillside, forming the unmistakable black arch of Bramblegate Tunnel. Fog pooled around it like something alive. The lantern at the entrance flickered with a sickly yellow glow. Reed stopped in his tracks. "Miss Marple, I don't think we should—" "Constable," she interrupted softly. "If someone is inside that tunnel, someone who may be hurt, we mustn't hesitate." He looked torn between fear and duty. But Miss Marple had already begun walking. She followed the footprints straight to the entrance. The smell of damp stone and old rust drifted from the darkness. Miss Marple examined the ground again. The prints lead inside. Reed took a shaky step back. "But footsteps in the mud would stop on stone." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And that is why we must look for something besides footprints." She lifted the lantern from its hook and stepped deeper into the darkness. Inside Bramblegate Tunnel, the sound changed instantly. Outside, the world was muffled by fog. Inside, sound became sharper, colder, amplified by the stone walls. Every drop of water hit like a whispered threat. The lantern glow stretched just far enough to illuminate the old railway ties. Miss Marple walked slowly along them, tapping her cane ahead in careful intervals. Reed followed behind with considerable hesitation, flinching at each echo. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "do you think the noise we heard earlier came from the same person who made those footprints?" Miss Marple paused, considering. "No," she said. "I think we are dealing with two people. One inside the tunnel, and one who brought something or someone here." Reed's eyes widened. "Two?" "Yes, Mr. Halbert's note mentioned him, singular. But the dragging noises, that suggests something being moved, not someone wandering alone." Reed's hand shook visibly. But why drag anything into a tunnel? Why not hide it somewhere less conspicuous? "Because," Miss Marple said gently, Criminals often make the mistake of believing darkness will hide all things. She lifted the lantern higher. Something glinted on the track. Miss Marple crouched again. It was a thin strip of metal bent, scratched, and smeared with dried mud. A nail from a boot, she said. A heavy boot. Likely the same person who left the footprints outside. Reed knelt beside her. Miss Marple, if this person is still here. Miss Marple shushed him gently. Then she pointed. Far ahead, at the midpoint of the tunnel, the darkness thickened abruptly, forming a shape. Not a wall, not rock, a man, standing absolutely still. His silhouette was tall, broad-shouldered. Facing them, Reed jolted upright, nearly dropping his cap. Who's there? Halt, identify yourself. The figure did not move. Miss Marple remained calm. She lifted the lantern. The light revealed nothing. The figure dissolved, not vanished, but revealed itself to be nothing more than a trick of shadows cast by an irregular stone outcropping. Reed exhaled loudly. Good Lord. I thought, yes, Miss Marple said gently, one must be careful. The tunnel plays tricks on the mind. She moved forward, but as she passed the shadowed stone, something else came into view. Something unmistakably real. A torn sleeve. Embedded between two stones, as though ripped violently from a coat. Miss Marple examined it. Wool, she whispered. Coarse, dark, the same as the scrap caught in the brambles outside. But whose coat? Reed asked. Someone who entered before us, Miss Marple said, and left in a hurry. The wall that should not have been they continued deeper until the lantern light revealed something unexpected. A wall, a newly built one, constructed of stacked stones and old mortar, blocking what should have been the far end of the tunnel. Reed's mouth fell open. Miss Marple, this wasn't here last month. I swear it wasn't. Miss Marple approached the wall slowly. Fresh mortar, scrape marks on the ground. Dust unsettled recently. Someone had sealed off a portion of the tunnel very recently. Reed looked horrified. Why would someone block off the end? What's behind it? The end. What's behind it? That, Miss Marple said quietly, is what we must determine. She examined the base of the wall. There were faint streaks, drag marks, leading toward it, the same rhythm as the footsteps. Thud, drag, thud, drag. Miss Marple pressed her hand against the stone. Cool to the touch, impenetrable. Then she saw it. A crack. Narrow, almost hidden. Just enough to let a faint draft escape. And with it, a sound, not an echo. Not the drip of water. A faint, rhythmic noise. Tap. 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 Miss Marple froze. Reed whispered, trembling, What is that? Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then she said softly, That, Constable, is someone tapping from the other side. Reed paled. Alive? Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She stepped closer, placing her ear against a stone. Tap. Tap. Pause. Tap. She straightened slowly. Yes, she whispered. Alive and trying to signal. Reed stumbled back. Then Mr. Halberd? Miss Marple held up a hand. No assumptions, Constable. But someone is behind this wall, and they want to be found. She lifted the lantern, eyes hardening with resolve. And I fear, she continued softly, that whoever built this wall intends for them not to be. Chapter 6. Cement on Boots and the Man Who Knew Too Much. For a long, thin moment, the world inside the tunnel shrank to 3 simple sounds: tap, tap, dot, then silence. Constable Reed stared at the sealed wall as if it might suddenly open of its own accord. His hands were trembling, his breathing shallow. Miss Marple, by contrast, seemed almost unnaturally calm. Only the slight tightening at the corner of her eyes betrayed how grave she considered the situation. "Constable," she said quietly, "someone is alive behind that wall. That is no ghost, no echo, no superstition. You must act." Reed swallowed. "We will need tools, men. We can't knock down a stone wall with our hands." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied. "But there is no time to waste. Whoever is behind there cannot have an unlimited supply of air." Reed's face blanched further. "Good Lord. You're right." He turned abruptly. "I'll fetch help from the village," he said, voice unsteady but determined. "We'll get crowbars, hammers, whatever we can find." Should I leave you here?" "Oh no," Miss Marple said mildly, though there was steel in her tone. "I have no intention of standing in a dark tunnel listening to someone suffocate behind a wall. We shall go together. And in the meantime, I shall be thinking very carefully about who in this village knows how to build such a structure, and why they would." They made their way back toward the tunnel entrance, the lantern swinging shadows along the curved stone like long, reaching hands. As they approached the light, the fog outside looked almost welcoming by comparison. Once they were out in the cold air, Reed broke into a half-run up the slope. "I'll gather a small group," he called over his shoulder. "Tom Blakely, Mr. Kemp both have strong arms. And perhaps the vicar's groundsman. He's handy with masonry. And you might also wish," Miss Marple added gently, "to fetch someone who can recognize Mr. Halbert's clothing, in case we do not find only one person behind that wall." Reed flinched but nodded. "I'll send word to Mrs. Winford. She know." He hurried away, disappearing into the mist. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back for a moment to gaze at the tunnel's mouth, a wall built recently. Footsteps dragging. A man possibly trapped. Another missing. A constable who hesitated to tell everything he knew. And a villager who had lied about Mr. Halbert's habits. It was, she reflected, a very busy little tunnel indeed. The village Estar. By the time Miss Marple reached the willow and ran again, word had already begun to spread, as it inevitably did in any village. Faces turned toward her with thinly veiled curiosity as she stepped inside. Some were anxious, some suspicious, others merely hungry for drama. Rosie Winford hurried over, her brow furrowed. "Constable Reed just came through," she said breathlessly. "He said they're going to break part of the tunnel wall. Said someone might be trapped inside." Her voice wavered. Is it Mr. Halbert?" Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "We do not know yet, my dear. That is what we are trying to discover." Mrs. Winford emerged from the back, apron still on, cheeks flushed from hurried movement. Is it true?" she demanded in a low, urgent voice. "They say there's someone alive inside that tunnel. Is it nonsense, or—" "It is not nonsense," Miss Marple said calmly. "There is certainly someone there, but I cannot yet say who." Mrs. Winford's hand flew to her chest. "Oh, merciful heavens! Now is the time for clear heads, not panic," Miss Marple said kindly. "Constable Reed needs strong arms and a cool mind." "He has gone to fetch help?" "Yes," Mrs. Winford said faintly. "Tom Blakely ran out just after him. Mr. Kemp left in a hurry too, muttering about the old days and that cursed line." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And where is the vicar?" "He should be at the rectory," Rosie replied. "He comes here closer to noon. Why?" "Oh, no particular reason," Miss Marple said, though her eyes said otherwise. "I merely find vicars very often know more about their flock than anyone suspects, and sometimes about their sins as well." A spot of seum into Miss Marple stepped back outside after a few minutes, preferring the honest chill of the air to the thickening atmosphere of anxiety inside. She walked slowly along the lane, retracing in her mind the map she had found beneath. Mr. Halbert's floorboards, blocked off since '58, should stay that way. Someone's been down there. Who would know about a hidden chamber beneath the tunnel? Someone with access to railway plans. Or someone who had worked closely with those who did. A former signalman, perhaps. A maintenance crewman. Or an inquisitive villager with too much time and curiosity. Or someone who had inherited such knowledge, passed quietly down like a family secret. Her train of thought was interrupted by a familiar voice. Miss Marple. Tom Blakely came around the bend at a half-jog, panting. He had clearly been to and from somewhere in haste. Over his shoulder, he carried a battered tool bag, from which the ends of a crowbar and a hammer protruded. "Reed said you'd found." "Someone," Tom said, gulping air. "Behind a wall, is it?" "In the tunnel?" "That is correct," Miss Marple said, watching him closely. "You seem well prepared." Tom gave a short, strained laugh. "Well, can't knock down stone with polite conversation, can we?" He shifted his weight from one foot to another, and that was when Miss Marple saw it. On his boots, just above the sole, crusted along the edge, was a smear of pale gray. Not mud, not chalk, cement, very fresh cement. Miss Marple's gaze lingered a moment too long. Tom followed it, glanced down, and quickly scuffed his boots against a stone as if to wipe them clean. "Been helping out at a shed repair." He said a shade too quickly. "Old Mr. Kemp's place. Leaky roof. You know how it is." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "How very community-minded of you." He relaxed slightly. "Reed said to meet at the ridge in 10 minutes. You'll be joining us, I suppose?" "But of course," Miss Marple said, her voice light. "I should like very much to see what is behind that wall." Tom nodded and hurried off. Miss Marple watched until he disappeared from view, her mind quietly rearranging its suspicions. Cement on his boots. A new wall in the tunnel. A lie about Mr. Halbert going near the tunnel at night. Either Tom Blakely was the unluckiest man in Bramblegate, or he was involved. The vicar's HESITATIAON before joining the men at the ridge. Miss Marple made a brief detour to the rectory. The vicar, Reverend Dawlish, answered the door with an expression of polite confusion that quickly turned to concern when he saw who it was. Miss Marple, he said. Goodness, you've certainly chosen an eventful time to visit Bramblegate. Do come in. She declined with a gentle smile. I won't keep you long, Reverend. I merely wondered if you remembered a boy who went missing some years ago. A boy last seen near the tunnel. The vicar's face changed. There was a moment, just a flicker, of something like guilt. Yes, he said slowly. Jonah Pike, a bright boy. Mischievous but good-hearted. He liked to explore places he oughtn't. The tunnel fascinated him. And Mr. Halberd? Miss Marple asked. What was his relationship with the boy? Arthur? Dawlish frowned. He warned Jonah away from the line, as I recall. Said it wasn't safe. Jonah didn't listen. Children rarely do. After the boy vanished, some people blamed Arthur, said he'd frightened the lad into running away. Others thought he trailed off. Thought what? Miss Marple prompted gently that the tunnel itself was cursed. Dawlish finished, though he did not sound convinced by the superstition. And you, Reverend? Miss Marple asked quietly. What did you think? Dawlish hesitated. I thought there was more to it than we were told. But the railway closed that year. Men were let go. Records were locked away. People moved on. Or tried to. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. People do try to move on from unfinished stories. The trouble is, unfinished stories seldom move on from them. She straightened. One last question, Reverend. Do you know who in the village has experience with masonry? With building or sealing stone? With building or sealing stone? The vicarage was repaired last year, he said, thinking. Tom Blakely helped. So did the groundsman, Peter Halley, and Mr. Kemp used to work maintenance on the rail line in his youth. He'd know his way around stone and mortar. Very helpful, Miss Marple said. Thank you. As she turned to leave, she noticed something odd. On the inside of the rectory door, just by the latch, was a faint smear of the same pale gray substance she had seen on Tom's boots. Cement. She tucked that away quietly and took her leave. Toward the WL. The time Miss Marple reached the ridge again. A small group had gathered. Constable Reed, Tom Blakely, old Mr. Kemp, a wiry man with keen eyes, and a large, broad-shouldered fellow she presumed was Peter Halley. The vicar's groundsman, crowbars, hammers, and lanterns lay ready. Red looked anxious but resolute. We're ready to start, Miss Marple. Are you certain about the sounds you heard? I am quite certain, she replied. And I advise you all to work quickly, but carefully. We do not know how the structure behind that wall is supported. Kemp snorted lightly. Old railway tunnels don't fall that easy. They were built to last. Yes, Miss Marple said. But this wall was not. They entered together, the tunnel swallowing them into its cold stone throat. As they reached the sealed end, the men exchanged uneasy glances. Right, Red said, trying to summon authority. Tom, Peter, start with the upper stones. Kemp, mind the lantern. The first blow of the crowbar echoed like a gunshot. Stone cracked. Dust spilled. A chunk of mortar fell away. Then dash tap, tap, tap. Clearer now. Closer. Did you hear that? Reed whispered. Even Tom went pale. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. He knows you're coming. Another blow. Another crack. Stones loosened, shifting forward. A thin, cold draft slipped through the widening gap, carrying with it a faint smell, stale air, damp, and something else. Something metallic. Blood. Miss Marple's hand tightened on her cane. Careful, she warned. We are very close now. Peter drove the crowbar into a central stone and heaved. It crumbled inward. A rush of dark, heavy air burst through the opening, making the lantern flames flicker violently, and from beyond the broken wall came a sound that made every man freeze. Not tapping. Not footsteps. A hoarse, rattling breath, followed by a voice, cracked, weak, but unmistakably human. Help, please. Miss Marple stepped forward, eyes steady. Hold the lantern closer, Constable, she said quietly. We are about to see who has been buried in Bramblegate Tunnel, and perhaps who put him there. Chapter 7. The Man Behind the Wall and the Name. He whispered. A hush fell over the tunnel, not the natural stillness of stone and shadow, but a thick, living silence, coiled with dread. The men held their breaths. Even the lantern flames seemed to stiffen, as though the very air resisted movement. The voice behind the wall came again, faint and ragged. Please. Help. Constable Reed stepped forward instinctively, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. Steady, Constable. We must widen the opening, not rush blindly. Tom Blakely nodded stiffly and swung the crowbar again. This time, the stone cracked with a deeper, more satisfying echo. Dust spilled in clouds. Another stone dislodged. And another. The hole grew large enough for a lantern beam to spill through. Peter Hawley held his lantern forward, its weak glow piercing the dark chamber behind the wall. At first, nothing was visible. Then a hand. Thin, dirty, trembling violently. Reed made a strangled sound. Dear Lord. Careful, Miss Marple urged. Do not pull him abruptly. He may be injured. Peter and Kemp worked together now, prying stones aside with frantic urgency. As the gap widened, the figure on the other side became clearer. A gaunt man, slumped against the far wall of a narrow chamber no higher than 5 feet. Dust and dried earth coated his coat. His face was ghostly pale, streaked with sweat and grime. Eyes sunken but aware. Miss Marple stepped forward, her composure unbroken. Mr. Halberd, she said softly. The man's dull eyes lifted to her, widening just slightly. You know me? Yes, she replied. Everyone in the village does. Reed exhaled shakily. He's alive. Thank God he's alive. But Miss Marple did not move. She was watching Halberd closely, watching the flicker of recognition, the shadow of fear, the way his gaze kept shifting, not toward the rescuers, but toward the entrance of the tunnel. As if he feared someone might be watching. Help me out, Halberd whispered hoarsely. Please. We shall, Miss Marple said, but slowly. Tell me, are you injured? Halberd shook his head weakly. No, not injured, starving, trapped. Trapped by whom? Miss Marple asked softly. The men paused their work. Sudden tension radiating through the tunnel. Halberd shut his eyes, gathering what little strength he had. Then he whispered one name, a name that fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the group. Tom. Tom Blakely froze. Every eye turned toward him. Reed's voice cracked. Tom? Tom did this? Tom took a half-step back, anger flaring in his expression. Too quickly. That's madness, he snapped. He's delirious. Hasn't eaten in days. Doesn't know what he's saying. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Curious, Tom, how swiftly you assume he has been without food. You spoke as though you expected he had been here for days. Tom's face twitched. I meant. Mr. Kemp, narrowing his eyes, stepped closer to Tom. Tom, lad, you've been acting queer since Halberd went missing. Always near the ridge. Boots covered in muck and stone dust. Peter Halle added in his low, rumbling voice, and cement. Fresh cement. Tom's eyes darted wildly. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but unyielding. You built the wall, didn't you? Tom's chest rose and fell rapidly. His mouth opened, perhaps to deny, perhaps to flee. But Halberd's voice, cracked and thin, cut through the tension. He buried me alive. Because I knew. A tremor ran through Tom's hands. Reed stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs, and that was when Tom bolted. He didn't run for the tunnel entrance. He ran deeper inside, toward the darkness, toward the sound of collapsing echoes. Reed shouted and sprinted after him, the other men pounding behind. Miss Marple did not move. She remained beside the wall, watching the dark swallow Tom's retreating footsteps. She had already guessed he wouldn't escape. The REC with Tom gone and Reed in pursuit. Peter and Kemp redoubled their efforts, breaking away more stones until the opening grew wide enough for Halberd to crawl through. Miss Marple crouched gracefully, far more easily than her age suggested, and held out her hand. Take your time, she murmured. Slow breaths. You are safe now. Halberd's hand, bony, trembling, reached out and clasped hers weakly. With Kemp and Peter supporting his arms, they eased him out of the chamber. His legs buckled immediately, and Miss Marple guided him gently to sit near the wall. Water, she said calmly. Rosie Winford's small flask, brought earlier for emergencies, appeared from Peter's tool bag. Halberd sipped, wincing as the cool liquid hit his parched throat. After a moment, his breathing steadied enough for him to speak. He caught me, Halberd whispered. I saw him going down to the old maintenance route. The chamber. I followed. He panicked. Hit me from behind. When I woke, the wall was half built. He said I knew too much. What did you know, Mr. Halberd? Miss Marple asked. Halberd closed his eyes. About Jonah Pike. A ripple of shock passed through the men. The boy who vanished. Miss Marple murmured "HLBERD," nodded faintly. He didn't run away. He didn't fall. Someone hid that child's body in the old chamber. Years ago. Kemp crossed himself. Halberd continued, voice cracking. I found the boy's cap down there years ago. Never told anyone. Didn't want to accuse without proof. But a week ago, I saw Tom near the chamber. Saw him carrying something heavy. What something? Miss Marple asked. Halberd swallowed. A sack, large, dragging it. Same sound you heard in the tunnel. Thud, drag, thud, drag, mortal weight. Peter muttered grimly. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. Or evidence. Halberd nodded. I followed him. He caught me. Sighed I'd ruin everything. Said the past needed to stay buried. And so, Miss Marple said, voice tightening ever so slightly, he buried you instead. Halberd shivered uncontrollably, but Miss Marple was not finished putting together the picture. She asked one final question. And the vicar? Reverend Dawlish. Was he involved? Halberd's eyes opened, wide with shock. No, good heavens no. Tom hated him. Said the vicar. Stole everything from him. The railway job, the land, sympathy after the boy's death. Tom followed Jonah the day he vanished. I knew he lied. He always lied. Miss Marple breathed out slowly. The shape of the truth was now visible. Reed, or Reed, emerged from the tunnel after several tense minutes. Panting heavily. He's gone, Reed said breathlessly. Tom escaped out the far side, must have squeezed through a crack in the service shaft. But he can't have gone far. He will go where all cornered men go, Miss Marple said softly. Home or hiding. Both are very poor choices for guilty men. Reed nodded. We'll set a search party at once. After, Miss Marple said firmly, you get Mr. Halberd to safety. Reed knelt beside the weakened man. We'll take care of you now, sir. I promise. Halberd managed a faint, grateful smile. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned her eyes toward the tunnel mouth, toward the fading fog outside and the empty path Tom had taken. Her voice, when she spoke, was almost a whisper. The truth, you see, is very patient. It waits beneath stone and shadow. It waits behind walls. But it never stays buried forever. She tightened her grip on her cane, and neither should justice. Chapter 8. A desperate man on the run and a boy who never left by late afternoon. Bramblegate was no longer quiet. The news had spread from door to door, hedge to hedge, like a strong wind catching dry leaves. Mr. Halberd found alive. A secret chamber in the tunnel. Tom Blakely fled. Curiosity, fear, and something darker flickered behind curtains as villagers peered out onto the lanes. Children were pulled indoors. Lanterns were lit earlier than usual. Bramblegate had seen gossip before, petty feuds and seasonal scandals, but this was different. This was a crime laid bare. Still moving, still unfinished. Miss Marple walked back toward the village at a measured pace, her mind organizing everything she had learned into neat invisible rows. Tom Blakely. Cement on his boots. A wall built in haste. A man buried alive. A boy missing for 8 long years. She knew from long experience that when a man ran, it was not only from the law. He ran from the moment his lies could no longer keep his own thoughts quiet. She also knew that truly desperate men made very foolish, choices, and she was counting on that. The search begins. Constable Reed, flanked by two young farmhands who had volunteered to help, came striding along the lane, face set with an uncertain mixture of resolve and panic. "Miss Marple," he called, "we've posted men near the main road and the fields. If Tom tries to leave, someone should see him." "Very good," Miss Marple said. "And have you searched his lodgings?" Reed grimaced. "Not yet. I was headed there next." "Then I should like to accompany you," Miss Marple replied mildly. "There are often things in a man's home that he forgets to bury with the rest of his secrets." Reed hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But stay behind me, please. We don't know if he's gone back there." "Oh, Constable," Miss Marple said gently, "if he is there, I do not believe I am the one in danger." They turned down a narrower lane toward a small row of cottages just beyond the green. Tom's place was the third in line, a squat, plain-fronted dwelling with peeling paint and a crooked window box that had long ago given up on flowers. The front door was closed, but not locked. When Reed turned the handle, it creaked open at once. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room in a single, practiced glance. No overturned chairs, no fresh mud prints, no scuffed floors. "He hasn't come back," she said quietly. "Not yet." Reed exhaled slowly. "Then he's hiding somewhere else." "But where?" "Let us first see," Miss Marple murmured, "what he has already tried to hide." Tom's house and the weight of old Ariasianisms. Cottage interior was simple enough. A small table, one chair, a narrow bed, a chest at its foot, and a shelf of mismatched crockery. A coat hung on a peg near the door, not the one he had worn that morning, but an older, shabbier garment. Miss Marple stepped lightly toward it. She ran a gloved finger across the cuff. "Dried mortar," she observed. "Older than what we saw on his boots. He has been working with stone for quite some time." Reed moved to the chest and opened it. Inside were folded shirts, a pair of worn trousers, and underneath them a tin box. Reed looked at Miss Marple. She nodded. He opened it. Inside lay a collection of railway-related odds and ends, an old ticket punch, a faded train schedule, a broken whistle, and a small leather notebook. Reed lifted the notebook. "Looks like a diary," he said. Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Tom Blakely does not strike me as a diarist. But men do often write when they feel the world is failing to listen." Reed opened it and began to read aloud. The early entries were nothing more than bitter complaints about odd jobs, poor pay, and the lack of opportunities since the railway closed. But halfway through, the tone shifted. The writing grew sharper, more frantic. They all felt sorry for the boy. Not for me. I was the one blamed. Dawlish talked like I was guilty. Looked at me like a sinner every Sunday. Halberd told me to keep quiet about that day. Sighed I was lucky. Said the village needed a tragedy more than a culprit. Miss Marple's eyes stilled. "Go on," she said softly. Reed swallowed and continued. "I only pushed him. I didn't mean for him to fall. He slipped. Hit his head. It was an accident. Halberd said we had to hide him. Said they'd hang me if they knew. He took me down the maintenance shaft. We carried the boy together. I never slept right after that, but he did. Neat house, quiet life, like nothing happened. Reed's voice faltered. My God. Halbert helped. Finish, Miss Marple said gently. Reed turned the page. He said the chamber was sealed, that no one would ever find him. But then he changed. Started writing things down. Staring at me in the tea house. He kept saying, secrets don't stay buried. Said he might tell the vicar. Might tell Reed. If he talks, it all comes back. They'll blame me. They always blame me. I just needed him to stop talking. The final entry was short. Tonight, I'll fix it. Once and for all. No more footsteps. No more ghosts. Reed shut the notebook as though it burned. So Tom did kill Jonah, he said, voice hollow. And Halbert helped hide it. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, Constable. Tom caused Jonah's death. The accident may have been unintentional, but the hiding of the body, that was deliberate. And Halbert, in his fear, chose cowardice over confession. She looked out the small window, where fog still hung low over the hedges. Fear, she said quietly, is responsible for as many sins as malice. Where a desperate man, Geo's Reed, sank onto the lone chair, notebook clutched in his hand. So what happens now? If Tom escapes, he will not escape, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Desperate men do not think clearly enough to vanish. They run to two places where they feel wronged, or where they feel safe. Reed frowned. Safe? You mean a friend's house? Or the place of someone he believes still owes him something, Miss Marple said. Someone he blames. Reed's gaze sharpened. The vicar. Exactly, said Miss Marple. Reverend Dawlish tried to comfort the village when Jonah disappeared. It is clear from Tom's writing that he interpreted that as an accusation. That resentment would have festered over years. Reed stood abruptly. Then we need to get to the rectory, now. Yes, Miss Marple agreed calmly. Preferably before Tom decides that if he must be dragged into the truth. He will not go alone. The rectory CONFRONTATIO, and they reached the rectory as the first faint wash of evening began to darken the sky. The house loomed larger than others in the village, its stone walls partly veiled in ivy, windows glowing with a soft amber light. The front door was ajar. Reed didn't wait. He pushed it open fully. Reverend Dawlish. He called. It's Constable Reed. Are you all right? Silence. Then, from the drawing room, a voice, strained but steady. In here. They entered. Reverend Dawlish stood near the mantelpiece, pale but composed. On the opposite side of the room, crouched near the window, was Tom Blakely. One hand was clenched around a heavy brass candlestick. His breathing was ragged. His eyes, when they turned toward Miss Marple and Reed, were wild. Stay back, Tom snapped. I'm not going to prison for an accident. I won't do it. Dawlish raised his hand slightly, as if calming a wild animal. No one is here to hurt you, Tom. We want to talk. Talk? Tom laughed bitterly. You've been talking for 8 years, Vicar. Every sermon, repentance, truth, unburdening, all of it aimed at me, wasn't it? Dawlish shook his head. No, Tom. I had my suspicions, yes. But the guilt you heard was your own. Tom's grip tightened on the candlestick. You think you're clever, don't you? All of you. Halberd with his notebook. The old woman poking around. The constable pretending to be kind. Miss Marple's voice floated softly through the tension. Tom, she said, put it down. There is nothing in that candlestick that can fix what has already happened. It can only make it worse. Tom glared at her. You don't understand. They'll hang me for Jonah, for Halberd. They'll say I'm a monster. No, Miss Marple replied. They will say you are a coward. A frightened boy who became a frightened man and chose concealment over courage every single time he had a chance to do the right thing. Tom flinched as though struck. You didn't mean to kill Jonah. Miss Marple continued steadily. But you did kill him. You pushed him. You panicked. You helped hide his body. That was not an accident. That was a choice. And when Mr. Halberd finally listened to his conscience and threatened to tell the truth, you made another choice. You tried to silence him permanently. Tom's face twisted. He wanted to confess. Wanted to drag me down with him. Said we both had to suffer for what we did. Easy for him to say. He didn't push the boy. No, Miss Marple said quietly. He only watched you drown in guilt while he stood on the shore. He was not innocent. But that does not make you blameless. Reed took a tentative step forward. Tom, if you turn yourself in now, it will matter that you finally stopped running. Tom laughed once, a short, broken sound. Stop running? That's all I've been doing for 8 years. Every footstep in that tunnel sounded like his. Every echo. Like Jonah calling my name. He raised the candlestick slightly, but not toward anyone. Toward himself, as if ready to swing at the world. Then he sagged. The weight of the metal lowered slowly. I just wanted it to stop, he whispered. I thought if Halberd disappeared, the tunnel would go quiet. Miss Marple's voice softened, but it didn't, did it? She asked. Because the sound you were hearing wasn't only from the tunnel. It was inside your own head. Tears sprang to Tom's eyes, angry. Frustrated, but undeniably real. For a moment. He looked very young, very tired. The candlestick clattered to the floor. Reed moved swiftly, securing Tom's wrists with practiced efficiency. Tom did not resist as Reed led him toward the door. Tom turned once, not toward the constable, not toward Dawlish, but toward Miss Marple. Do you think, he asked hoarsely, the boy ever forgave me? Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. I think, she said, that forgiveness belongs to God and Jonah, but justice, Tom, justice belongs to us. And it has been waiting 8 long years. Tom dropped his head. They took him away. Miss Marple remained a moment longer in the rectory drawing room, listening to the echo of fading footsteps on the path outside. Reverend Dawlish sank into a chair. I suspected, he confessed quietly, but I was never sure. I thought, if God wanted the truth known, he'd find a way to reveal it. Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the hill and the faint line of the tunnel were just visible in the dimming light. Oh, Reverend, she said softly, Truth doesn't fall from the heavens fully formed. It arrives in fragments, a footprint here, a loose stone there, a whisper in the dark. All we can do is be willing to see it, and brave enough to follow where it leads. She picked up her cane, and now, she added gently, we must see that Jonah Pike is finally brought out of the shadows, so he may rest where he ought to have been all along. Chapter 9. Bones in the Dark and the Wait of 8 Years. The next morning, Bramblegate woke to a different kind of silence, not the uneasy, watchful quiet that had hovered over the village in recent days, but a tense calm, the stillness that comes after a storm. When everyone knows the damage is yet to be fully counted, Tom Blakely was no longer just a loud voice at the tea-house. He was a prisoner in a cell at the small station on the far side of the village. Word of his confession, partial though it was, had spread, carried in low voices and shaken whispers. The name Jonah Pike was on everyone's lips again, as though it had been waiting just beneath the surface for permission to be spoken aloud. And beneath Bramblegate Tunnel lay a chamber that would no longer remain sealed. Miss Marple stood once more at the entrance to that tunnel, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The fog had not yet lifted entirely, but the light felt different today, clearer somehow. More honest. Constable Reed stood beside her, clutching his notebook not as a shield now, but as a responsibility. Behind them, Peter Halley and Mr. Kemp waited with tools in hand, crowbars, shovels, canvas sacks. Their faces were grim but resolute. Are you quite sure you wish to be here for this, Miss Marple? Reed asked quietly. Oh, yes, Constable, she said, her voice gentle but firm. When one insists upon digging up the truth, one must not look away when it finally sees daylight. He nodded, and together they stepped inside, returned to the chamber. The tunnel felt less menacing today. Its echoes were the same, its cold air unchanged. But the oppressive weight of mystery had lessened now that so much of its secret had been pried open. When they reached the broken wall at the end, Reed held the lantern steady while Peter widened the opening further. Dust fell in small clouds. A stone clattered away. The chamber beyond waited, a dark, squat cavity cut into the earth, no bigger than a small shed. Its air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something far older. Miss Marple stepped close, peering inside. Careful how you enter, she cautioned. We must disturb as little as possible, not only for evidence, but out of respect. Reed swallowed. Yes, of course. Peter and Kemp edged into the narrow space, lantern held between them. For a moment, there was only the scrape of boots on stone. Then Peter drew in a sharp breath. Oh. Reed looked at Miss Marple. She nodded once. They followed. Inside, the chamber's low ceiling forced them to stoop. The walls were rough and the floor uneven. Toward the far left corner lay a small, collapsed shape, half covered by an old, rotting canvas. Peter knelt and pulled it back slowly. Beneath it lay the remains of a boy. Time had reduced Jonah Pike to bones and scraps of clothing. A frayed shirt, once blue, clung to the slender frame. A broken shoe dangled loosely from one foot. Near his skull lay a small, faded object, a wooden toy train with chipped red paint dot. No one spoke for several seconds. Reed's face crumpled. Peter bowed his head. Kemp inhaled shakily through his nose, eyes glistening. Miss Marple, however, did not cry. Her grief was quieter, carried in the way her hands tightened around her walking stick and the slight tremor in her exhale. "There he is," she said softly. 8 years too late, but found at last. Reed wiped hurriedly at his eyes. We should document everything, properly. I'll need to notify the magistrate, the coroner. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But before you do, there is one thing you might wish to note. She pointed gently to the boy's skull. There, just above the right temple, was a distinct fracture, a sharp, localized break as if from a blow against stone. Not the result of a long fall, she said quietly. More likely a short drop and a hard impact. Consistent with what Tom wrote, a push, a stumble, and a head struck against rock. Reed nodded, jaw tight. It fits, and the cap? Miss Marple asked. Peter, still kneeling, reached further into the debris. After a moment of searching, he pulled out a small, faded cap. Its fabric eaten by age and damp. Here, he said hoarsely. Miss Marple looked toward the opening where faint light seeped in. There is your proof. Constable, she said. Enough, I think, to support Tom's account of an accident turned into something far worse by fear and poor decisions. Reed nodded again. We'll bring him out gently. Jonah deserves that much. He signaled for the men to begin preparing a stretcher. Miss Marple stepped back out of the chamber, into the main tunnel, needing the slightly fresher air. As she stood waiting, listening to the muted sounds of careful work behind her, she heard footsteps approaching from the entrance. Lighter this time. Measured. She turned to see Mr. Halbert. He was still weak, leaning heavily on a borrowed walking stick. But there was a stubborn resolve in his eyes. Mrs. Winford hovered anxiously near the tunnel mouth, clearly reluctant to come any closer. I told him not to, she called uneasily. But he insisted. Halbert stopped a few feet from Miss Marple, breathing slightly harder. I had to see. He rasped. Miss Marple regarded him with a steady gaze. Then you shall, she said. But you must also speak. M.R. Halbert C.O. says I.O. and they stepped aside as Peter and Kemp carefully carried Jonah's remains out past them, wrapped now in a sheet. As the small bundle passed, Halbert wavered. His shoulders shook once, then twice. That's him, he whispered. The boy, Jonah. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Now he is no longer a theory, or a ghost, but a child who can finally be laid properly to rest. Halbert swallowed hard, for a moment. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch. Then she said gently, You should tell Constable Reed the full extent of your involvement now. Mr. Halbert, his notebook did not describe your role entirely truthfully, I suspect. Halbert winced. Tom. He made me sound worse. He always did, Halbert muttered. I told him it was an accident. I told him to come forward. He refused. Said no one would believe him. Said they'd pin it all on him. And you. Miss Marple asked, I tried to stop him, Halbert said. I grabbed his arm when he went to run. The boy had already fallen. There was blood. Too much. I panicked. Tom panicked. He was crying, shouting that they'd hang him. I didn't know what to do. You chose, Miss Marple said softly, to hide the body instead of calling for help. You rebuked Tom for his panic, and then shared it. Halbert closed his eyes. I thought if we said nothing, it would fade. Time would smooth it over. But it never did. The tunnel. Every time I walked past it, I heard him. Not his footsteps, his silence. And when Tom began talking of fixing the past, Miss Marple continued, you finally found your conscience again. You tried to warn Reed. You wrote in your notebook. But you did not move quickly enough. Halbert nodded, guilt etched deep into every line on his face. I followed Tom the night before last, he said. Saw him dragging something toward the tunnel. I thought it might be the boy. Maybe he wanted to move the body, hide it elsewhere. I confronted him. We argued. He said if I talked, he'd tell everyone I'd helped bury Jonah. Said no one would believe I'd ever wanted to confess. He hit me. When I woke, I was behind that wall. Miss Marple listened without interruption. You understand, she said after a moment, that while Tom pushed Jonah, you helped bury the truth. That is a sin of its own kind, I know, Halbert whispered. And I'll answer for it. Reed approached now, having given the men instructions to carry Jonah's remains to the vicarage, where space had been prepared for him. Mr. Halbert, Reed said, voice steady but not unkind, you will need to give a formal statement. But I can tell you now, the fact that you finally told the truth, even late, will matter. Doesn't feel like enough, Halbert murmured. It rarely does, Miss Marple said gently. But a wrong can only be corrected from now, not from then. Jonah comes home later that afternoon. The village gathered in front of St. Aldwyn's parish, the same church whose bells had rung. In comfort 8 years before, when Jonah Pike's fate was still unknown. Now, at last, it was known. The small, simple coffin that held his remains rested at the front of the nave. Reverend Dawlish stood nearby, hands clasped, eyes damp. Jonah's mother, older and more fragile now, had been brought by relatives from a neighboring town. Her grief was not the sharp agony it had once been, but a quieter, exhausted sorrow. Miss Marple sat toward the back, letting the villagers have the front pews. This was their story, their loss, and their closure. Reed stood at the side, hat in hand. Tom Blakely would not be present, of course. His reckoning would come in another kind of chamber. Halbert sat several rows behind Jonah's mother, shoulders stooped, hat clutched tightly in his hands. Reverend Dawlish's voice echoed gently through the church. We are gathered not only to mourn a boy taken too soon, he said, but to acknowledge a truth too long buried. Jonah was not lost, he was hidden. And today, by God's grace and the courage of those willing to seek the truth, he has been restored to us, not in life, but in dignity. Heads bowed. Some wept openly. Miss Marple merely closed her eyes for a moment. Dawlish continued, his tone both firm and tender. Let this village remember this. Silence in the face of wrong is not kindness. It is not protection. It is fear. And fear, if left unchallenged, grows into something far more dangerous than any ghost story whispered about a tunnel. A ripple of recognition seemed to move through the pews. Miss Marple opened her eyes and glanced sideways. Mrs. Winford was crying quietly. Rosie was holding her hand. Old Mr. Kemp stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Peter Hale's eyes were fixed on the floor. At the very back, near the door, a few children peeked in, wide-eyed, solemn, absorbing a lesson that might shape them for years to come. A village exhales. After the service, people filtered slowly out of the church, speaking in soft, subdued tones. Some nodded to Halbert as they passed, others did not. That, Miss Marple thought, was only natural. Forgiveness was not a single act, but a process. Outside, the air felt clearer. The hill that hid the tunnel seemed less ominous. Even the crows on the fence posts had found their voices again, cawing in harsh, everyday irritation instead of watchful silence. Mrs. Winford approached Miss Marple, with Rosie at her side. "Will it be over now?" Mrs. Winford asked. "The footsteps?" "The fear, all of it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The footsteps in the tunnel will cease," she said. "Of that I am quite certain. As for fear, it seldom disappears entirely, but it can be replaced with honesty, vigilance, and the knowledge that a village will not let the truth be buried again." Rosie squeezed her mother's arm. "I'm glad he's not just missing anymore. It always felt wrong." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple replied softly. "The human mind can make peace with tragedy. What it cannot endure is uncertainty." Reed joined them then, looking tired but lighter somehow. "Tom will be held for trial," he said. "He's admitted enough now that he knows it's pointless to lie. And Halbert has agreed to testify to his own part in the concealment." "You've done very well, Constable," Miss Marple said kindly. "Bravery is not the absence of fear, you know. It is doing what must be done in spite of it." Reed blushed slightly. "I only wish I'd asked more questions sooner." "So do most good men," Miss Marple said, "when all is finally revealed." She turned her gaze toward the distant arch of Bramblegate Tunnel, now just a dark outline on the hillside. "Still," she murmured, "the tunnel will no longer whisper unanswered questions. That is no small thing." Chapter 10. The Last Echoes of Bramblegate Tunnel. For the first time since she had arrived, Miss Marple walked through Bramblegate, with no sense of something unseen pressing at the edges of her awareness. The village was not suddenly cheerful. That would have been impossible, and quite unseemly besides, but its tension had shifted. The fear had been sharpened into grief, its edges honed by truth. And grief, unlike fear, could eventually be laid to rest. She made her way along the cobbled lane toward the Willow and Wren tea house, where Mrs. Winford had insisted she come for one last proper cup before you leave us, Miss Marple, and don't you dare say no. The little bell chimed as she pushed the door open. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than usual, but not suffocating. People spoke in low tones, more thoughtful than gossipy. Even the clink of teacups had a subdued dignity. Rosie looked up from the counter and smiled shyly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Mum's kept your usual table." "How very kind," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "I shall begin to think I am quite spoiled." Mrs. Winford bustled out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, cheeks pink. "Goodness, there you are," she said. "I kept wondering if you'd slipped away without a goodbye, like some sort of angel of justice." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, my dear, I assure you I am no such thing. Merely a very old woman with very sharp ears." "Yes, well," Mrs. Winford replied, placing a pot of tea on the table with a decisive clink, "you did what none of us managed to do in 8 years. So you'll forgive me if I see a bit more than teacups when I look at you." Miss Marple poured herself a delicate measure of tea and waited for the steam to clear before responding. "I did not bring the truth here," she said gently. "Your village had it all along, in old maps, in memories, in little slips of the tongue. All I did was listen to what was already being said. Even silence, you know, speaks volumes if you are willing to hear it." Mrs. Winford sank into the chair opposite her, expression softening. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" she asked quietly, knowing what happened, knowing Tom did that as a boy, and Arthur helped hide it. "We've known them for years, shared tables with them, sat beside them in church." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Normal," she said, "is a very elastic word. You will find a new kind of normal. One that includes this truth rather than pretending it never existed. Children will grow up hearing the story of Jonah Pike, not as a whispered legend, but as a cautionary tale. And perhaps, when they find themselves at crossroads of fear and honesty, they will make different choices." Rosie joined them, sliding delicately into the chair at the corner of the table. "I'm glad it's out," she said softly, "even if it hurts. It always felt wrong, like the whole village was pretending not to hear something." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That was the tunnel's most dreadful trick, you know. Not the echoes of footsteps, but the echo of what everyone refused to say." A final visit to the CONSTABF to tea, Miss Marple walked to the small police station. It consisted of 2 rooms, one for paperwork and one with a single barred door. It was more symbolic than imposing, a reminder that even in a small village, there were rules that could not be politely ignored. Constable Reed stood at the front desk, hat off, sleeves slightly rolled. He straightened at the sight of her. "Miss Marple," he said, "I was hoping I'd see you before you left." "Then we are both fortunate," she replied. "How is your prisoner?" Reed sighed. "Quiet. He's stopped protesting and stopped raging. Mostly sits now. Stares at the floor. I think, after all these years of running inside his own head, being in one place feels almost like a relief." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "There is a peculiar kind of peace that comes when one has finally stopped building new lies to cover old ones." Reed hesitated, then asked, "Do you think there's any chance he might change? That this might make him better? Or is it simply punishment from here on?" Miss Marple considered. "Punishment," she said slowly, "is what the law concerns itself with. Change, however, That belongs to the individual. Tom has been living with one story for 8 years. I'm a helpless victim of one mistake. Now he must live with a new one. I made many choices, and they all had consequences. What he becomes after that is still up to him. Reed nodded, absorbing this. And Mr. Halberd? He ventured. The inspector says he will likely face reduced charges. Complicity. Withholding evidence. But his age and eventual cooperation will be taken into account. I should think so, Miss Marple said. He will have to live with his decisions for whatever years he has left. That is its own sentence, though not nearly as neat as a written one. Reed looked at her for a long moment. I owe you an apology, he said unexpectedly. I doubted you at first. Thought you were just interfering. A visitor with too many questions. I should have trusted your instincts sooner. Oh, my dear boy, Miss Marple replied kindly. If constables went about trusting every inquisitive old lady who crossed a village border, the world would be in dreadful disarray. You were cautious. That is no sin. But you were also willing to listen when the evidence contradicted your comfort. That is much rarer, and far more important. He smiled faintly. Will you ever come back to Bramblegate? He asked. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Perhaps, she said, though I should much prefer that my next visit be entirely dull. Reed laughed quietly. I'll do my best to see that it is. The last walk to the Whodunit, there was one more place Miss Marple needed to see before she left. It felt only right. She took the familiar path past the hedgerows, through the thinning fog, up toward the ridge where the tracks cut their way into the hillside. The lantern at the tunnel entrance had been removed. In its place stood a small wooden post with a simple notice tacked to it: Railway Tunnel Nitrogen Monoxide Entry, by order of the local authorities below it. Someone had placed a small bunch of wildflowers, white and purple, bound together with twine. Miss Marple knew somehow that Rosie had put them there. She stood before the mouth of Bramblegate Tunnel and listened. No footsteps, no dragging sounds, no taps from behind walls, just the faint, natural murmur of air moving through stone. The tunnel, she thought, no longer sounded haunted. It sounded empty. At last, she murmured, you are only what you always were, a passage, not a grave. A bird flitted past overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Life, unburdened by secrets, was already resuming its rhythm. Miss Marple turned away, her steps steady on the path. Farewells and quiet gratitude. The bus stop near the village boundary was little more than a bench and a signpost, set beside a hedge that had done its best to grow around it. Miss Marple arrived with a few minutes to spare. Mrs. Winford, Rosie, and Mr. Halberd were already there. You didn't have to come, Miss Marple said. Nonsense, Mrs. Winford replied. You may not think yourself an angel, Miss Marple, but you're certainly not leaving Bramblegate like some ordinary tourist. Rosie smiled shyly. I wanted to say thank you, she said, not just for solving everything, but for believing there was something to solve. Grown-ups here kept saying, let it be, the past is gone. You didn't. The past, Miss Marple said softly, never really goes anywhere, my dear. It simply waits to be acknowledged. Halbert stepped forward, hat in hand. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said gruffly. "Least of all from someone as sharp as you. But I do want to thank you. If you hadn't pushed, I'd have gone to my grave pretending I had no choice. You took that excuse away." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "Mr. Halbert," she said, "forgiveness is not mine to grant or withhold. But I will say this. There is a great difference between a man who makes a terrible choice and clings to it, and one who finally faces it, however late. The boy deserved better from you. You cannot change that now. What you can do is ensure that no more boys in this village ever pay for men's cowardice." He nodded, throat working. "I'll try." "I should hope so," Miss Marple replied kindly. "It is, after all, never too late to be useful." The distant rumble of the approaching bus reached them then, growing louder as it came over the hill. Mrs. Winford dabbed at her eyes. "If you ever need a room again, you'll find one ready at Winford House," she said. "Scones, too. And no hauntings, if I can help it." "I shall hold you to that," Miss Marple replied with gentle amusement. The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes. The driver tipped his cap. Miss Marple stepped up onto the first rung, then paused and turned back for one last look at Bramblegate. The village lay spread behind her, its church spire, its clustered roofs, its hedgerows, its people. A place like so many others, she thought, capable of kindness, of fear, of folly, and, when pressed, of courage. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she boarded the bus. Epilogue footsteps. Ari and Mimbe as the bus rolled away down the lane. The villagers gradually drifted back to their homes, their work, their slowed but ongoing lives. In the months to come, children would still dare one another to run near the tunnel, though they would stop at the notice and look with curious eyes at the place where so much had been hidden. Stories would be told, not of ghosts, but of mistakes, of silence, and of the price of both. Jonah Pike would be buried in the churchyard, his name no longer a question mark but a carved certainty. Weathering among the other stones, Tom Blakely would stand in court, his fate decided by law, but his story would already be part of the village's memory. A warning whispered from parent to child: tell the truth, even when it hurts. It is kinder than letting it rot in the dark. And Bramblegate Tunnel, once a place of sinister footsteps and secret chambers, would become something else entirely, a reminder that even the darkest passages can be forced to give up what they've swallowed, if someone is brave enough to listen long enough, and to follow the echoes to their source. Far away, in a different village with different hedges and a different church, Miss Marple would sit quietly by a fire, her knitting in her lap, her mind as alert as ever. There would be other villages, other secrets, other wrongs shyly peeking from behind the curtain of respectability, but Bramblegate at last could sleep, and in the silence where once there had been only fear, there would now be something far more peaceful. The soft, steady heartbeat of a truth finally brought into the light. Miss Marple's closing reflections as we leave behind the misty quiet of Bramblegate and the echoing stones of its forgotten tunnel. One truth remains clear: no secret, no matter how deeply buried, lies still forever. Footsteps may fade, walls may crumble, but the truth, patient, persistent, and quietly determined, always finds its way back to the light. Tonight, Justice walked slowly, with soft shoes and sharper insight, guided by an elderly woman whose strength lies not in force, but in observation, compassion, and the courage to listen when others turn away. Thank you for journeying through this mystery, for following every clue, every shadow, every echo in the dark. And as Miss Marple steps into her next quiet village with its own hidden questions, we invite you to join her again, because where her keen eyes travel, mystery is never far behind. If you enjoyed this story, do share your thoughts below. Which moment surprised you most? Which clue gave the truth away for you? Until the next tale unfolds, sleep well, travel safely, and beware the footsteps you don't expect to hear.